Good afternoon. Welcome to The Analyst. Today we'll be taking up 7 newspaper articles from the Hindu and the Indian Express and discussing them. The handout for the same will be available in the description of this video for your kind perusal. Please have a look at that. The first article that we'll take is related to India-Canada relations, as the ties are being reset and the high commissioners will be appointed by both the sides. The second article is related to the fintech sector, as the Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman emphasized upon the role of the fintech sector in the agriculture and the rural areas. Additionally, we'll take up 5 articles in the simplified which will be helpful for your prelims and mains preparation. The first article is related to India-Canada relations. The context behind it is that the two countries are going to reset the ties now. With the ouster of Justin Trudeau and with the incoming Mark Carney, the two countries are going to revive the trade talks. They are going to appoint the high commissioners to each other. This is even more significant given the recent drift in the India-USA relations. President Trump of USA claims credit for brokering the ceasefire between India and Pakistan. India is unwilling to give credit to Trump for that. And India maintains that there has never been any mediation from any third party regarding the India-Pakistan issues. These are bilateral issues, and in future also we will not accept mediation from the third party for India-Pakistan issues. Therefore, the increasing engagement between India and Canada is even more significant. So we will discuss the contemporary Canadian geopolitics, the significance of Canada for India, the challenges in the bilateral relations, and the suggestions in this regard. This is important in GS2 under the topic Effect of Politics and Policies of Developing and Developed Countries on India's Interests and Indian Diaspora. The India-Canada relations, they faced a low point during the regime of Justin Trudeau. And one of the major factors was the sovereignty concerns, because Canada was sheltering the Sikh extremists, which was a matter of sovereignty concern for India. So let's first discuss the concept of sovereignty in the modern times. When we trace the concept of state sovereignty historically, we can go back to the 17th century, the Treaties of Westphalia, the Peace of Westphalia as it is popularly known. The treaties were signed to prevent the war in Europe, the 30 years war which had led to the loss of millions of lives, and this led to the emergence of the concept of state sovereignty also, that the state should be sovereign in decision making. There should be no interference in the decision making in the domestic affairs of each other. There should be respect for the territorial integrity and sovereignty. But this state sovereignty concept has been chipped away gradually over a period of time. For example, the sovereignty got eroded in the 19th century through concepts like manifest destiny. The idea of manifest destiny was floated to promote the justification for the American settlers. It was believed, the belief was that the American settlers, they will inevitably colonize and capture the Americas, the continent of Americas. This was an erosion of the sovereignty of Mexico. Likewise, in the 20th century, the erosion of sovereignty happened due to colonization. The Western nations, the developed nations, the advanced countries, they colonized the developing countries, and therefore the sovereignty of the developing countries was compromised. Similarly, in the 21st century, the globalization also eroded the sovereignty. It was eroded through concepts like dual citizenship, immigration, digital connectivity, etc., which blurred the lines of state sovereignty and the absolute authority of the state in the matters of decision making regarding its internal affairs, regarding its domestic affairs. And when we observe in the modern geopolitics, the concept of sovereignty, it is asserted even more ferociously by the rising powers. For example, in the case of India, we assert our sovereignty as observed in the India-Canada relations. Likewise, as observed in our assertion that POK is an integral part of India, the Pakistan occupied Kashmir, and we protect our territorial integrity and sovereignty. And we can observe that it has led to certain geopolitical flashpoints also, the sovereignty concept. For example, the Russia-Ukraine war, Israel-Hamas conflict, all of them related to sovereignty, and the erosion of sovereignty has led to the fight backs. Now coming to the India-Canada relations specifically, the erosion of sovereignty, the threat to sovereignty was observed through the Sikh separatism, the Khalistan issue. And it was observed that Canada harbors, gives shelter to the Sikh extremists, which may be extra-national threats to India's concept of sovereignty and territorial integrity. We can observe this through the case of Hardeep Singh Nijjar. For that, we have to go back and observe a few events. For example, in 1984, India launched the Operation Blue Star. Through the Operation Blue Star, the Indian forces entered into the Golden Temple to flush out the Sikh extremists who were hiding there, and the Sikh leader Jarnail Singh Bhindranwala was killed. In reply to that, Prime Minister Indira Gandhi was assassinated by her 2 Sikh bodyguards, which led to the anti-Sikh riots also in India for a brief period of time. Post that, there was the bombing of an Air India flight, for which there was the blame which was put on the Sikh separatist groups, and it was observed that even Hardeep Singh Nijjar was also involved. But subsequently, Canada refused to extradite the Sikh extremists from Canada to India, and even Canadian citizen Hardeep Singh Nijjar became the president of the Sikh temple in Vancouver. Subsequently, in 2023, Nijjar was shot dead near the Sikh temple in Vancouver, and Justin Trudeau accused India of its involvement in the assassination of Hardeep Singh Nijjar, which India denied, and we observed that these allegations are baseless and therefore we refuted them. Now coming to the contemporary Canadian geopolitics, under the regime of the previous Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, the relations between India and Canada reached a low point, as observed through the Nijjar case and subsequently the interference allegations. It was alleged that India interferes in the domestic and political affairs of Canada. The Canadian Parliamentary Committee even observed that India is a threat, a foreign threat for them, which is baseless obviously. And Justin Trudeau was tolerant of the Khalistani elements. Under the garb of protecting free speech, the right to free speech, the Khalistani elements in Canada were shielded there. Justin Trudeau was getting politically weak. He was trying to shore up the domestic support. For that purpose, he was taking an anti-India rhetoric. And subsequently, it led to the mutual expulsion of the diplomats also, which led to a new low point in the India-Canada relations. Simultaneously, there were the attacks from the side of the President Trump of USA. Trump even observed that Canada can become the 51st state of USA, which led to a nationalist feeling emergence among the Canadian citizens. And then the elections happened. In the elections, the Liberal Party came back to power as expected. The factors were a few. For example, the external factor being the influence of Trump, and the internal factor being the transition in the Liberal Party from Justin Trudeau to Mark Carney. Simultaneously, the New Democratic Party, NDP's influence has also come down, and Jagmeet Singh from NDP has lost his seat, and the NDP has been a vocal supporter of the Sikh extremists, the Khalistani activists in Canada. And due to the declining influence of the NDP and the exit of Jagmeet Singh, now the chances of strain between India-Canada relations will be lower and will be able to move the ties further. Also, Mark Carney is a distinguished economist. He has served as the ex-governor of the Bank of England and the Bank of Canada. Therefore, his pragmatic approach towards economy and the trade ties will help in boosting the India-Canada trade ties. When we look at the power dynamics in India and Canada relations, India is the 4th largest economy, whereas Canada is the 9th largest economy. And India exports more to Canada than it imports. Our exports to Canada are more than $5 billion. And we have a large diaspora also. We have more than 6 lakh Indian students studying in Canada. And we have more than 1 million Canadians of Indian origin who are residing in Canada. But there are certain concerns in the India-Canada relations. One, when we look at it historically, there are a few events which lead to flashpoints. For example, Canada had commented upon Kashmir. It had even called for a plebiscite in Kashmir in 1984. Likewise, Canada had opposed the Operation Smiling Buddha. Operation Smiling Buddha of India was to conduct the peaceful nuclear explosions. At that time, as a protest against India, Canada had even recalled its High Commissioner to India. And after the Khalistani extremists spread, it had refused from extraditing the Khalistani extremists from Canada to India. For example, the extradition of Talvinder Singh Parmar, it was refused by Justin Trudeau's father, who was in power at that time. And Justin Trudeau is also seen as being proximate to the sympathizers, the Khalistani extremists, and his political reliance being upon the Khalistani support, for example, support from the NDP and the anti-India rhetoric. And he adopts double standards on sovereignty. For example, in the Hardeep Singh Nijjar case, he claims that the sovereignty of Canada has been violated because of the alleged interference from the side of India in the assassination of Nijjar. But on the other side, he ignores the Indian concerns regarding our sovereignty. And the alliance with the New Democratic Party is also a matter of concern. The current Liberal Party also has the alliance with the NDP, seeks support from it, and NDP has been a supporter of the Khalistani elements, the Sikh separatists in Canada. And the strategic partnership which was signed in 2015 is in ruins now. It has to be revived as well. Now, what is the significance of India-Canada relations? One, we have had ties with Canada historically. For example, during the times of freedom struggle also, both India and Canada were colonies. Even Canada was also ruled by the British. And during India's freedom struggle, the Indian activists in Canada had set up the Swadesh Sevak Home in Vancouver to mobilize the support against the British rule in India. Therefore, we have the historical ties, and also both are part of the Commonwealth now. And we need cooperation from each other in the Indo-Pacific, because India can provide for the alternative to China. The China is becoming the disruptive global power now, and India can become that stabilizing power, the counterbalance to China, especially in the Indo-Pacific region. Unless there is cooperation from India, the Indo-Pacific strategy of not only Canada but US also may be fractured. And when we look at the trade, the India-Canada ties are significant. In 2024, the trade was to the tune of $8.4 billion. India is the 10th largest trade partner of Canada. In terms of energy also, the cooperation is significant. For example, in 2010, the Nuclear Cooperation Agreement was signed, and we import uranium from Canada. In the matters of technology as well, the relation is significant. For example, the Canadian Space Agency has signed the Memorandum of Understandings with ISRO. The Antariksh, the commercial arm of ISRO, launches satellites of Canada also. And there is a joint science and technology cooperation agreement also put in place. At the multilateral fora as well, the cooperation is required. For example, at the recent G7 summit, for which the outreach invite was sent to India as well. We will need Canada for having that geopolitical leverage among the global north. We want to engage with the global north also, not only become the leader of the global south. And for that, we will need cooperation from Canada because, for example, it is part of the important alliances, for example, the Five Eyes Alliance. And we have a significant diaspora there, for example, 4% of Canada's population of Indian origin, and there are several members of parliament in the Canadian parliament also who are from the Indian origin. When we look at the bilateral trade specifically, the Canadian exports to India are mineral products, paper goods, vegetable products and metals, and from India we export the chemical products, textiles, metals, machines, etc. Now, what are the challenges in the resetting of India-Canada ties now? One, there are some adverse remarks sometimes. For example, the Canadian Parliamentary Committee report had observed that India is the second biggest foreign threat for them, citing the alleged interference of India in the internal, domestic and political affairs of Canada, which is not true. Second is the Khalistani separatism. The Sikh extremists, the Khalistani activists in Canada are part of their vote bank. They support the New Democratic Party. And the New Democratic Party in turn gives its support to the Liberal Party, which is in power. Therefore, the present Canadian regime has to balance the Sikh assertions and simultaneously the relations with India. Also, sometimes there are attacks on the Indian consulates and the Indian diaspora in Canada. In the matters of trade, we need to bring down the protectionism. Protectionism will lead to the imposition of tariffs and counter tariffs, and the trade will not be liberalized. And the labor laws also need to be simplified so as to promote the free movement not only of the labor but also for the skilled professionals as well. And we do not have a comprehensive economic partnership agreement also. The free trade agreement also needs to be finalized. And simultaneously, Canada has relatively cordial relations with China, which also becomes a matter of concern for India. Now, what suggestions can be given to reset the India-Canada ties? One, we can engage with the Sikh diaspora. We need to engage with them to counter the misinformation which is spread by the Sikh extremists and the Khalistani elements, to ensure that we maintain the goodwill among the Sikh diaspora. Second, we can dehyphenate the two issues, Khalistan and trade. They can be dehyphenated so that we can sign the free trade agreement. We need an early progress trade agreement to be signed to promote trade between India and Canada. And we can collaborate in different spheres, environmental sphere, the renewable energy sphere, so that we can collaborate across international initiatives like International Solar Alliance, promotion of green hydrogen, etc. And we can promote the track 2 diplomacy also, that means the engagement with the civil society. Now, there is a mains practice question as well. In light of the recent diplomatic strains and geopolitical uncertainty, examine the significance of resetting India-Canada relations, discuss the key challenges impeding the relations and suggest viable pathways to rebuild the mutual trust and cooperation. Please try to write it. The next article is related to the fintech sector. The context behind it is that the Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman has emphasized upon the growing role of the fintech sector. The fintech sector should look at the rural areas and agriculture not only as a social responsibility but also as the new markets, the emerging markets. So we will discuss the significance of fintech sector in India, the challenges that the sector faces and the suggestions in this regard. This is important in GS3 under the topic Indian economy and issues related to planning, mobilization of resources, growth, development and employment. So what is fintech sector? Fintech means finance plus technology. Any business that combines finance and technology utilizes technology to provide financial services. Any business that uses technology to enhance or automate the financial services. They may be using blockchain, they may be providing for payments, they may be providing for online banking, investment services or even crowdfunding, etc. So the fintechs can be of three types majorly. One, the payment fintechs, for example, the payment wallets like the Google Pay, Phone Pay, providing for the payment services, or even the payment gateways like BillDesk. And there can be insurance fintechs. They are providing for insurance services like Policy Bazaar, Paisa Bazaar, etc. And the investment fintechs, etc. For example, the Grow app, the Jirodha or Angel One, they are providing for the investment services and the Demat accounts. When we look at the status of the fintech sector in India, it accounts for the third largest ecosystem in India, and the UPI, the Unified Payment Interface alone accounts for 3/4 of the digital payments in India. Therefore, the government is also promoting it. There are various initiatives promoting fintech sector, for example, the JAM Trinity, Jan Dhan, Aadhaar Mobile, Open Network for Digital Commerce, Central Bank Digital Currency, UPI as well as the India Stack. Through the India Stack, the open APIs are created and provided and the developers can build their apps using those open APIs as the base. Now, what is the significance of the fintech sector for India? One, it can promote the financial inclusion, even for the businesses also. For example, the small vendors, they can become part of the UPI ecosystem and they will be able to accept online payments and pay online and become part of the digital ecosystem. Likewise, it can improve the credit access, especially for the businesses like the MSMEs, the micro, small and medium enterprises. They will be able to access the credit from the formal channels rather than going for informal channels and become victims of fraud. The fintech will be able to cover the unbanked also. People who are not part of the formal banking channels, they will also be able to pay online and receive online payments through the various fintech apps, and it will be able to fill the gender gaps also, especially in the rural areas, far-flung areas, etc. Plus, it can promote the customer ease. For example, services like investments. Now, you can invest easily by using apps like the Grow app, any Demat account apps like Kite, etc. You will be able to invest easily. And it has led to the incoming of the foreign direct investments into India. and which has led to building of more unicorns in India. The unicorns are usually those startups which achieve the valuation of more than $1 billion. And it leads to the employment generation also. As more skill is required, more skill is developed, and the employment is created, it leads to the economic growth and becomes a social driver as well. How? For example, the crowdfunding apps, they provide for funds for the people who want to become the entrepreneurs also, and therefore the fintech sector can promote the entrepreneurship as well as become a social driver. Now going further, the fintech sector will be even more significant for India. As the regulatory streamlining happens, the fintech sector will promote the ease of doing business further in India, and the innovations that take place in the fintech sector, that can be utilized by the regulators also. For example, the regulators can test the usage of blockchain for contracts with the fintechs by using the sandboxes. Plus, they can be linked to the other objectives as well. For example, the promotion of digital payments at the tourist hotspots can promote the tourism. It will help us in meeting our tourism promotion objective, and it will be leading to the shift in the cultural mindset of our country, that we are predominantly a cash dependent economy, and by promoting the digital payments we'll be able to shift that mindset as well, and ultimately bringing about the reforms in the allied industry segments also. For example, bringing about reforms in the mutual funds, capital markets, insurance, etc. But there are certain challenges that the fintech sector faces. For example, the cyber threats. Most of the data that the fintech companies, businesses collect, that is stored online, and it is prone to be stolen, and there are privacy concerns as well, and the data privacy compliance also needs to be done, particularly if the data collected is that of the citizens of the European Union. The EU data privacy guidelines are even more stringent and difficult to meet. And there are unethical financial practices also that are adopted at times by the fintech companies. For example, illegal digital lending, mis-selling, opaque lending, and these are governed by an archaic law, the Usurious Loans Act of 1918. And there is market imbalance as well, which can be observed from the fact that about 73% of the transactions by volume are through the fintech companies, whereas only 7% by value it is there. So by value, the large transactions are not happening through the fintech apps, but the volume share is high. Likewise, there are infrastructural challenges also. For example, the lack of internet connectivity, especially in the rural areas, far-flung areas. And there are regulatory gaps also. Regulatory gaps can be observed in the fintech sector. For example, the crypto regulation. The crypto regulatory framework needs to be updated in India. And there are data localization requirements also which are imposed at times. If the fintech companies are operating in multiple jurisdictions, multiple countries, then imposing data localization norms upon them may be difficult for them to implement. And there are allegations of money laundering as well, that through the fintech apps money laundering happens. For example, an app, the People app, which is based in Abu Dhabi, the Chinese scammers used it, the Chinese investment scammers used it for money laundering from India to UAE. Therefore, the fintech sector challenges need to be addressed not only in terms of the data privacy, but also in terms of the risk frameworks that they should be able to adopt, and the illegal activities that can be done through them. For example, terrorist financing, money laundering, etc. are prevented. And for that, their operating model, although they can operate based upon an asset-light model, but there needs to be a well-defined governance structure and proper budgeting for that, and the data security ultimately must be maintained. Now, what are the regulatory steps that the government has taken for the fintech sector? One, the Payment and Settlement Systems Act 2007 was put in place. As per this act, the prior approval of RBI is needed for the operation of any payment systems in India. And the NPCI regulations on the UPI also mandate the banks to create their own UPI based apps, and the RBI provides for the regulatory sandbox also. It was floated in 2019. Through that, the sandbox testing has to be done by the fintech companies before they float their apps, etc. Now this will be beneficial, the sandbox testing will be beneficial for both the regulators as well as the fintech players. For the regulators, it will be beneficial because it will increase the market efficiency, the downtime of the apps will be lower, it will lead to better risk management, and they will be staying on top of the technological innovation, since during the sandbox testing itself they will be able to identify what are the new innovative measures that are being adopted by the fintech companies, and they can evolve the regulations also accordingly, and it will give new opportunities to the consumers also. The sandbox testing is beneficial for the fintech players also. For example, the risk, if it is there, the regulatory risk also, it can be managed during the testing period itself, and it will lead to the reduced downtime when the app is live, and there will be more partnerships which can be done with the legacy companies, and the access to their APIs can also be there, and there will be regulatory clarity as well, which is also critical for ensuring that they get funds from the angel investors, venture capitalists, etc. Also, the RBI gave guidelines on digital lending in 2022 for unregulated digital lending and for the protection of the consumers' data. Now, there is a Parliamentary Standing Committee report also on the fintech sector, which has observed that the foreign entities are mostly owning the fintech companies in India. It was observed that the 80% of the transactions are happening through the Walmart backed PhonePe and the Google Pay, and the Indian fintech apps are usually not preferred. As per the Parliamentary Standing Committee report, the NPCI backed Bheem app was accounting for just about 0.22% of the transactions, and also it was observed that the fintech apps are being used for money laundering. For example, the People app based in Abu Dhabi. And also there is a regulation of the foreign apps which is needed, and the fraud to sales ratio is down to 0.0015% only, but the volume of transactions has been increasing, therefore the number of frauds have also been increasing. So what recommendations can we give regarding the fintech sector? One, the regulation of the digital payment apps has to be done. There can be a 30% volume cap on the transactions. That is, the previous 3 months whatever transactions were done, there can be a 30% volume cap based upon that, and we can encourage the multiple players entry in the fintech sector to promote the competition, so that there is no duopoly or the oligopoly of a few players in the fintech market. There is a means practice question also. The fintech sector is transforming India's financial landscape by enhancing inclusion and innovation. Examine the role of fintech in India's economy. What are the major challenges faced by the sector? Suggest ways to address them. Please try to write it. The next article is related to Iran-Israel war and its impact on India. This is important in GS2 under the topic Effect of Politics and Policies of Developing and Developed Countries on India's Interests and Indian Diaspora. Israel attacked Iran. It attacked even the nuclear facilities in Tehran. Now USA is moving its military assets in the region, the military jets and ships in the region, to protect Israel in case Iran strikes Israel. In turn, Russia has warned USA that it should not strike Iran. It may lead to a nuclear catastrophe. So we will first discuss the legality of the Israeli strikes. As per the international law, are they justified? There are certain arguments in favor of the Israeli strikes and there are certain arguments against it as well. The scholars who say that the Israeli strikes are justified are basing their arguments upon certain factors, for example, the right to self-defense. Article 51 of the UN Charter, the United Nations Charter, guarantees the right to self-defense. The right to self-defense in case there is an armed attack on any country. The proponents who justify the Israeli attack say that Iran has already been engaging in proxy attacks in Israel, and now there is the imminent nuclear threat also. Therefore, the Israeli strikes are justified as they are in self-defense. Another argument is the preemptive or the anticipatory self-defense. Since the Israeli strikes happened before any actual attack from the side of Iran, therefore they are anticipatory or preemptive self-defense. That was innovated through the Caroline Doctrine. The Caroline Doctrine was introduced in 1837 when the American ship Caroline was carrying arms for the rebels in Canada. They were being ruled by the British. That is when the doctrine was invoked and it was formed. It allows the preemptive strikes if the threat is instant overwhelming, and the threat leaves no choice, the threat leaves no moment of deliberation. That is, when there is such a threat upon any country that there is no choice but to go for preemptive self-defense, then it is allowed. In the case of Israel-Iran conflict, it is said by the scholars who justify the Israeli strikes that the Iran's nuclear program leaves no choice for Israel, and it may lead to an imminent nuclear threat also in the region. Another factor is the imminence of the threat. That the imminence of threat does not mean that it needs to be an immediate threat, rather its expansive view can be taken that it will ultimately lead to a threat, and anyway there is the rhetoric from the side of the Iranian establishment to destroy Israel ultimately. And it is also observed that the failure of diplomatic alternatives, for example the failure of sanctions, failure of negotiations, leave no other choice but to go for the military alternative, for example the attack on Iran now. Another school of thought which is against the Israeli strikes is saying that it is a violation of Article 2 subclause 4 of the UN Charter. Article 2 subclause 4 of the UN Charter prohibits the use of force except when it is in self-defense or it has been sanctioned by the United Nations. Except that there cannot be any use of force, it will be illegal, and there is no legal basis for the preemptive strikes also. It is just a potential future threat. It depends upon interpretations, and there has been no actual armed attack which actually happened in Israel before Israel went for the strike on Iran. And the word imminence, even the doctrine which promotes the imminence threat, is too broadly interpreted. Its restrictive view should have been taken as per Benioff. Imminent means it is temporarily proximate, that it is about to happen, which was not about to happen in the case of this conflict. And there is the risk of escalation also, therefore the Israeli strikes are not justified. The unilateral strikes based upon conjecture, based upon surmises, may lead to the setting of a dangerous precedent when in future any country can attack any other country, saying that we were going for the anticipatory self-defense or preemptive self-defense. And there are proportionality concerns also, that the strikes, they must have been proportionate as per the danger, the degree of danger, the level of danger of the threat that Israel was facing. Now what will be the impact of the Iran-Israel war in India? One, it will hurt us economically. For example, the basmati rice, 20% of the export of basmati rice from India happens to Iran. We export about 1.2 million tons to Iran. And the international prices of basmati rice have now dropped by about $100 per ton, and the stocks in India have piled up. Likewise, we export tea also. We export about 20,000 tons of tea to Iran, and the exports not only to Iran but to other countries will also be affected. For example, exports to Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan, which happen through Iran. And the freight costs as well as the fuel costs will increase due to the Iran-Israel conflict. The freight cost for both air freight as well as sea freight will increase, and the risk insurance premiums will increase because the chances of the merchant navy ships also being attacked increase. And there is the risk of the potential closure of the Strait of Hormuz also. If the Strait of Hormuz is closed, then it will add another 15 to 20 days to the shipping times between India and the Middle East, and about 40 to 50% of the shipping cost increase will also happen. Another impact will be in the form of the oil price rise. Iran has been giving recurrent threats to close down the Strait of Hormuz. The Strait of Hormuz is the choke point between the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman, and there is a transport of about 20 million barrels per day which happens through the Strait of Hormuz. If it is closed down, it may affect the oil transport, and this is amounting to about 1/5 of the global petroleum liquids consumption every day. 84% of the crude through the Strait of Hormuz is coming to Asia only, and the major export from Tehran is going to China. India is not importing the petroleum products from Tehran as much, but it will lead to the global price spikes. We are importing 80% of our oil needs, therefore we will also be a victim of the global price shock for the oil, and it may lead to escalation also. The escalation may bar the access to the Suez Canal as well as the Red Sea also, therefore cutting off the trade through the Gulf region, and we may have to take longer routes then. The next article is related to Operation Sindhu and Armenia. This is important in GS2 under the topic Effect of Politics and Policies of Developing and Developed Countries on India's Interests and Indian Diaspora. We are evacuating the Indian diaspora, Indian nationals in Iran through Armenia. Iran and Armenia share a 44-kilometer wide border. There is the passage into Armenia through the Norduz-Agarak border crossing. From there, we are bringing the Indian nationals to Delhi through a flight from Yerevan. Now, there are certain challenges that we are facing during the evacuation, that the Iranian airspace has been shut down indefinitely. Therefore, we cannot evacuate directly through flights from Iran. We have to evacuate them through the land borders by bringing them into another country from Iran and then evacuate through flights. Iran shares borders with other countries, but we are facing challenges there. One of the borders is with Pakistan. Pakistan remains India's primary geopolitical rival. Another border is with Turkey and Azerbaijan. Both Turkey and Azerbaijan professed support for Pakistan when the India's Operation Sindoor was going on. Likewise, another border is with Afghanistan, but Afghanistan is ruled by Taliban and we do not have the official ties with the Taliban-ruled Afghanistan. Another border of Iran is with Turkmenistan. But the Turkmenistan border of Iran is sparsely populated, especially on the Iranian side. Therefore, there are logistical challenges in evacuating through Turkmenistan. Whereas the border with Iraq is directly lying in the line of fire between Iran and Israel. While it is open at the moment, but it is difficult to evacuate from there because Iraq's own airports are mostly shut due to the conflict. Therefore, the Iran-Armenia border is the most viable option for the Indian evacuees. And since the Tehran and Norduz-Agarak crossing are well connected by a major highway as well. Now, what is the basis of Delhi-Yerevan ties? The years of Indian diplomatic efforts vis-a-vis Armenia are now paying dividends for us, as it is helping us evacuate the Indians stranded in Iran. While the Turkey and Pakistan are in the Azerbaijan camp, but India has been a staunch supporter of Armenia in its conflict with Azerbaijan, the conflict in the Nagorno-Karabakh region. And we have also become Armenia's biggest military supplier also in the form of a $250 million deal in 2022, supplying Armenia with Pinaka multi-barrel rocket launchers and also Akash-1S air defense system. Also, Armenia has publicly endorsed India's position on resolving with the Kashmir issue on a bilateral basis with Pakistan, and it also supports India's aspiration for a permanent seat in the United Nations Security Council. Located in the southern Caucasus, Armenia is a crucial cog in the international north-south transport corridor also, which will be connecting India to Europe through Armenia and Iran. Let's also have a look at some of the other evacuation missions that India has undertaken in the past. In 1990, we went for the Kuwait airlift. At that time, the Iraqi soldiers, about 1 lakh soldiers, had invaded Kuwait, and the royals and the VIPs there had fled to Saudi Arabia, and we airlifted the Indians who were stranded in Kuwait at that time. In 2006, we launched the Operation Sukoon. That was to get out the Indians who were stranded in the Israel-Lebanon conflict. It was termed the Beirut Sea Lift, and it was the largest naval rescue mission since the Dunkirk of the time of the World War II, when the British and French soldiers were stranded. Then India took up the Operation Safe Homecoming in 2011 to evacuate the Indians stranded in conflict-torn Libya. We also initiated the Operation Maitri in 2015 to evacuate the Indians and also the foreign nationals who were stranded in Nepal during the Nepal earthquake in 2015. The Operation Rahat was to evacuate the Indians who were there in the conflict in Yemen in 2015. The Operation Sankat Mochan was undertaken by the Indian Air Force to evacuate the people who were stuck in the South Sudanese civil war. The Brussels evacuation took place in 2016 as it was a response to the terrorist strikes that had struck Belgium. The Operation Nistar, taken up in 2018, was to evacuate Indians who were struck in the cyclone-ravaged Socotra Island. Operation Samudra Setu in 2020 was to repatriate the Indians who were stranded during COVID-19. Vande Bharat mission was also for the repatriation of the COVID-19 people. Operation Devi Shakti was undertaken to evacuate the Indians who were there in Afghanistan when the Taliban took over in Afghanistan. Operation Ganga was started to evacuate the Indians from the Russia-Ukraine war-torn region, and people were evacuated via Romania, Hungary, Poland, Moldova and Slovakia. Operation Kaveri was taken up in 2023 to evacuate people who were struck in the Sudan conflict. And in 2023 itself, Operation Ajay was also started to evacuate people who were struck in the Israel-Palestine conflict as well. The next article is related to the need for resetting India-US partnership. This is important in GS2 under the topic Effect of Politics and Policies of Developing and Developed Countries on India's Interests and Indian Diaspora. There has been a drift between India and USA. The ties have been drifting as observed in the form of a few events. First, Prime Minister Modi declined the offer of President Trump to stop over in USA while on the way back from the G7 summit. We cited prior commitments of Prime Minister Modi. In turn, President Trump of USA hosted the Pakistan Army Chief Asim Munir for lunch in White House. And the US rhetoric has led to the return of an India-Pakistan hyphenation. They are clubbing both India and Pakistan together in the same line, especially President Trump of USA. And Trump has been giving offer for mediation on Kashmir, which India does not want. It is a bilateral issue and we will sort out between ourselves. And he is giving remarks regarding the probable nuclear escalation also, which he averted, and claiming credit even for the brokering of ceasefire between India and Pakistan. Simultaneously, USA has also been discouraging Apple from expanding in India. They want the companies to invest in America itself, and there has been a protectionist shift observed in the H-1B visa policies also. Likewise, the CENTCOM has been calling Pakistan a phenomenal partner, and the strategic convergence between India and USA, which used to be visible earlier, that tone has been diminishing now. Now, what are the reasons for this drift between India and USA? One, the Trump's style of diplomacy has been rather transactional. He is prioritizing the short-term goals, the short-term diplomatic style, rather than going for the long-term benefits. And there is a nostalgia in USA, a particular nostalgia for Pakistan, looking at it as a familiar counter-terrorism ally, whereas it itself breeds terrorists. And there is a misreading by USA of India's strategic autonomy as well. They look at India's past indecisiveness also as the lack of autonomy. And there has been an asymmetry in communication also, and an observed institutional presence in Washington. Therefore, we need to ramp up on that aspect also. And there has been persistent Cold War era framings as well within the US policy circles, hyphenating both India and Pakistan. And there is a kind of US impatience also, which is observed with India's pace and method of strategic engagement, which has been evolving now. Now, what must India do to reset the ties with USA? One, we should avoid the overreaction. We can go ahead and adopt the quiet and calibrated diplomacy approach. We can deepen the engagement with the US Congress, not only going for the leader-to-leader talks, but also with the think tanks as well as engaging with diaspora in USA. We can reinforce the strategic alignment in defense, Quad as well as Indo-Pacific region. And the internal reforms are also needed so that we can boost the manufacturing appeal for India. As the companies shift out of China, they should look at India as the appealing alternative. We can reframe the immigration as mutual innovation. Immigration or seeking for liberal visa policies from USA should not be seen as a concession, rather as a contribution from the Indian diaspora, both in terms of economy as well as technological development. We can go for modest trade deals before the critical deadlines are coming near. Now, why do we need to rebuild the ties with USA? One, the India-USA partnership is rooted in shared values, shared democratic values as well as global vision. The world needs the two major democracies of the world to come together and enhance those values. Also, it is needed for the Indo-Pacific stability. Without the support of India, the Indo-Pacific strategy of USA will also be ruptured. And there have been past breakthroughs also which show the potential. For example, the signing of 2005 civil nuclear deal, which can go ahead and sign for another trade deal this time. And the strategic trust is essential to counterbalance China. A reset will also lead to a chance to convert the turbulence into an opportunity. Therefore, we can go ahead and try to reset our ties with the USA. The next article is related to the implementation of MGNREGA scheme in West Bengal. This is important in GS3 under the topic Indian economy and issues related to planning, mobilization of resources, growth, development and employment. Before coming to the article, let's discuss a few basics regarding the MGNREGA scheme. This is a demand-driven scheme. Any person who is unemployed can go ahead and demand the work under the scheme. Therefore, it provides a social security. 100 days work, unskilled work will be provided under the scheme per household in a financial year. Any person who is more than 18 years of age and a rural resident can go and demand for the work under the scheme. Let's also have a look at some of the data regarding the scheme. One, it is the world's largest anti-poverty program. And as per the Socio-Economic Caste Census 2011, 40% of the rural households in India are dependent upon manual labor and therefore they are surviving with the help of the MGNREGA scheme. 7.6 crore families have active job cards in the MGNREGA, and as per the NSSO National Sample Survey Organization, areas with the low consumption expenditure have a usually high demand for the MGNREGA work, and the women and SC/ST beneficiaries also account for a significant chunk of the beneficiaries of MGNREGA. It has also led to a paradigm shift in the welfare in India. Now it is a right-based approach. Therefore, any person who is demanding for work has to be supplied work under the MGNREGA scheme, otherwise unemployment allowance has to be given within 15 days of the demand. Therefore, it is self-targeting as well, as it is demand driven, and it is a bottom-up approach and ensuring grassroots democracy. For example, the Gram Sabha usually decides the work, the nature of work which needs to be done, and the transparency and accountability is also ensured by ensuring social audits, by ombudsman review, the proactive disclosures on the portal as well. Now coming to the article, the High Court in Calcutta has observed that no central scheme can be sent to cold storage forever. It has directed the center to restart the MGNREGA scheme in West Bengal effective from August 1. It has allowed the center to impose the special conditions not imposed in other states to ensure that there are no irregularities. The center had earlier stopped the implementation of MGNREGA scheme in West Bengal in 2022, alleging widespread irregularities and the non-compliance of its directives by the state. The court has observed that if the center wants, it can send the money directly to the account of a specific person through the central portal. The center can also carry out necessary surveillance to prevent corruption. In addition, the center can continue the investigations in all the districts of the state. The next article is related to the revision of the GDP base year. This is important in GS3 under the topic Indian economy and issues related to planning, mobilization of resources, growth, development and employment. The base year for the key macroeconomic metrics has been revised. For GDP, the base year has been revised from 2011-12 to 2022-2023, and the revised data will be released in February 2026. For the Index of Industrial Production, the base year has been revised to 2022-2023, and for the CPI, it has been revised to 2023-2024. When we look at the frequency of revisions, this is not the first such revision, it is the 8th such revision. The first GDP estimates were compiled in 1949 by the National Income Committee led by P.C. Mahalanobis, and later on the revisions occurred in 1967, 78, 88, 99, 2006, 2010 and 2015. Now what is the rationale for these revisions? One, they lead to accurate economic assessment. They reflect the structural changes in the economy. The methodology is also updated. They incorporate new data sources, new sectors as well as the international guidelines also. And the real growth is therefore captured by updating the base years as it adjusts for the inflation as well as the changing economic composition. But there are certain challenges in the GDP calculation. For example, it is complex as it excludes the intermediate goods. The focus is there only on the final goods, and there are data limitations also. For example, the informal sector estimates rely on the surveys like NSSO, census, etc. And there are economic shifts also that happen. For example, the transition from agriculture to the services-led growth. Now, why there has been no revision after 2011-12? The planned revision was to take place in 2017-18, but it was dropped due to the data issues, for example, unemployment and the poverty trends. And there were also policy disruptions. For example, demonetization in 2016, GST in 2017, COVID from 2020 onwards, which made the recent years abnormal. So we are going for the base year revision now. What will be the significance of 2026 revision? One, it will address the credibility concerns. The 2015 revision faced criticism for overestimating the GDP. And India is now nearing the third largest economy status after US and China, and it will also leave an investor impact, as the accurate data is crucial for policy making as well as the foreign investments. Thank you.